Welcome everybody to this event. It gives me real joy to see so many people here this afternoon. And yes, that is a deliberate reference to the final presentation today, which will be where Lou Mycroft will talk about Joy FE and its relationship to professional learning in this sector. So this event grew out of an event which was planned for March last year, which would have been, a physical event in Huddersfield. It was also organised through HUDCRES, so the Huddersfield Centre for Research in Education and Society, and the Learning and Skills Research Network. And I'm really pleased that we've managed to sort of build on what we planned then to put this event together today. And actually, as an online event, we've managed to reach probably a wider range of people. Many of you have been able to attend from different parts of the country and from all areas of what is quite a diverse sector, as you're well aware. So this afternoon, we would like to bring people together, and some of you have already been making those connections via the spreadsheet that we shared before the event, where you're able to put in your details about, your research interests, and then we hope that you might be able to connect with others who are doing things around maybe the same area as yourself, or whose research you are just interested in. So please continue to use that. You can use it after the event as well. And we've also got a Twitter hashtag, OSRNHUD21, which again many of you have started using already before the event. So what are our aims this afternoon? Well, you may well have your own motivations, for being here, but really our main sort of principles as we were thinking about this event were working out how we could find out more about professional learning across the sector, what we know already, what we know from research, what we know from our own experience, and to connect this research and practice. And obviously this also involves connecting researchers and practitioners, although many people will see themselves as both of those things. And that's something that Joyce Chen will be talking about in her presentation this afternoon. We also hope that the event will suggest areas of research that might be valuable and productive in the future, so that it leads forwards, from today, and that we start to identify, productive areas to consider in future. We've devised some questions coming out of the presentations this afternoon, and these will give a bit of structure to the discussions in the breakout rooms. Not in a very sort of a limiting way, but hopefully to give a bit of focus and direction to the afternoon. So questions around what it takes to create a research culture in FE, maybe what has enabled you to engage in research and what might enable you to do so in the future. Questions about subject specialist knowledge and how well that is developed in the sector. Personal questions around how you have managed to sustain your professional development over the last quite challenging period. And then what is needed to sustain this in the future, and particularly in uncertain times. Now, considering uncertain times, well, I love the title of the City and Guilds report, Sense and Instability. But I think it's a bit of an indictment, really, of policy making in the sector, that they've adopted that same title in 2019 as they did in 2016. And basically it's the same message, that this sector is characterised by instability, as Hanley and Orr state very clearly. 28 major pieces of legislation since the 1980s. And Norman Crowther will actually be looking at, a new one this afternoon, a new one to consider. And no sector organisation that has lasted more than a decade. So, if a new one comes along, people are naturally sceptical about, how long this will last, what role will it play. So we might want to consider, well, is anything fundamentally different about professional learning in the current uncertain climate, from the rest of the time? So what do we know about professional learning? Well, again, collected here today, we know a lot, from our own experience, from research that we're aware of, research that we may have carried out. I'd like to just share some findings from my own recent study, which was into recently qualified in-service teachers in FE and what they learn in their first year after qualifying. So I was looking at this, in terms of how it's shaped by the institutional and the policy context. And I'm going to focus really on 3 suggestions coming out of those findings. First of all, in order to learn, it's important for us to make sense of what we do and what we experience. And one of my participants, I think, stated this very clearly, that it's not just about, finding out about things. We need to be able to connect those to our own context and our own subject in particular. And again, that's something that I think Kevin Orr will pick up on later on. So we need to make those connections and be able to do that through our practice. And to do that, we need the time, we need the space to reflect, to think about things, and to be able to connect with others. So I'll give you a moment just to read what Leah said towards the end of the academic year that I was studying. So I was following them through a year, and this was towards the end of the year. So many of you may be able to identify with what Leah is saying there. But this sense that it's not enough to do things, to experience things. We need the time to be able to talk to others about them and to make sense of them through that process. And in the pressured environment of further education, that time is severely constrained. So that's where we can see the effect of policy, of a kind of a wider culture on what happens, with the individual teacher in the workplace. And interestingly, I suppose the new or the most challenging practices tend to be the ones that demand the most active sense making. They are the ones that people have to work hardest at to make sense of and to make meaning out of. And in my study, certainly from the data that I had, it wasn't the teaching that was the focus of that really active sense making. And in fact, one of my respondents said, we've got the teaching by this stage. It was quite a reductive view of teaching in a way, saying, well, we can do that. But it was interesting really how much that was borne out across the different participants. And she said, well, it's everything else that remains challenging. And she lists some of those things that constitute that everything else. So actually that sense-making process was being directed at coping with all the demands of quite challenging things like safeguarding, for example. So really quite complex situations that she was having to deal with. And another participant, this related not to teaching, but to the question of attendance, and specifically students saying, yes, I attended my maths class, and someone else saying, no, she didn't, or seeing on the system, for example, that no, that student hadn't attended that session. So Nicole goes into the staff room and she says, well, who do I believe? What would you do? So again, turning to colleagues to make sense of that situation and to work out what to do, and how to learn, in a sense, through that process. So we could consider then, well, what does this mean for different people involved in the sector? And these were only suggestions. This was a small scale study, so I think need to set that within that context. But I think the implications perhaps are broader than that, and are supported by other research that has been carried out in the sector. And first of all, if we think about policy making, well, it's important to consider how we use the policy levers that are applied and how they will affect the everyday practices of those working in the sector. Because if they serve to limit the time, the space, the opportunities for that interaction, that sense making, then actually they're restricting the learning of the teachers working in the sector. And similarly, really, for managers, they're working in a similarly constrained environment, but this recognition that that time and space is actually crucial and that connecting with others is crucial, it is very important that needs to be valued. And teachers themselves, I think, need to value those opportunities for reflection, for collaboration. So such as, us getting together here today, or meeting informally, discussing things on Twitter and so on. All those opportunities help us to make sense of our practice and to contextualize the things that we are finding out. So thank you. I will hand over to Norman Crowther. I won't introduce you, Norman, but if you probably introduce yourself as part of the presentation, I'm sure.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank
you. Introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it, and I hope what I have to say I've got some interest and reaches into the debates following the presentation. I'm Norman Crowther. I'm the National Official for Post-16 Education at the National Education Union, and we're great supporters of research in the sector. And as you'll see in the presentation, we're seeking to develop that thought further and certainly open our arms to any research projects or support we can give. So the title is A Research Culture in FE, What Will It Take? So this presentation is really an analysis of the issues that such a research culture may face, obviously some of the obstacles, but hopefully also some of the possibilities and potential for taking research forward, and research as a culture rather than research as a practice. In some ways it's a history of the present, because I think it's important to be aware of how we've got here. So it's not been obvious, it's not been straightforward. There have been significant opportunities in the past to develop, I would argue, a stronger research culture. It would have had different grounds, but we can look at that and entertain those possibilities and see if they give us any potential going forward. And then finally, it's really about seeking a strategy for change. It's not a view that everybody may hold, but I think that if we're aiming to introduce a research culture, I think we need to develop a strategy, something that's coherent, that has a specific vocabulary, that people can share in and talk about, rather than having different perspectives on what they think research is and how it might intervene in the sector. And that's not something that everybody may share. They may think it's best to have different opinions and different views. However, I'm just putting it out there that I think a coherent, a collaborative approach would be best and strongest. I think when we talk about a research culture, it involves areas of very strong integrated interest, and the one that I'm going to particularly focus on and emphasize is that of professionalism. I think there's an absolutely inextricable link between a research culture in FE and the issue of professionalism. In turn, I'll suggest there's another aspect to that which is expertise. I think expertise is something we have to tease out and identify in order to take forward FE professionalism and therefore to build on FE research culture. Rachel's quotation from her research about "we've got the teaching" in a way could be a touch point. It's not a criticism of the quotation or the feeling. The question I would put is that, is there more to a profession than that? Is it about competence and immediate practice, or does a profession take on wider responsibility? I'm going to suggest it should, and hopefully if we then devise a way of introducing that voice into colleges, into workplaces, educational institutions, I think we've got a chance then of embedding a research culture. As an example, the current debate between BTECs and T-levels is often done at the level of government and of lobbying groups, but I think a revised view of that, an FE professional sector with a professional voice, it should begin and end in the sector. It should have a check and balance with practitioner views on what those qualifications mean, what they do, and what they entail. So often the debates then are not so much about research within FE, but really research without FE and then imposed on it. And that, I think, is arguably the crucial breakdown in terms of policy turbulence in the sector and the lack of a check and balance within the sector. So government looks at the outcomes, it tries to work out what should be done, and then it imports them into what it conceives as the shape of that sector. Surely the argument could be that it's better to begin within the experiences and research of the sector itself, and there are examples of that. I think the Commission on Adult and Vocational Teaching and Learning did that. I think that the College of the Future did that. The question is, though, is that those major in a way, interventions and contributions to the debate more or less drizzled out into headlines and simply lines of work rather than an actual programme of work that would be taken to heart in colleges themselves. Another example I'd like to give is the Maths in FE College project. Again, shows how research within the FE sector, and particularly attuned to it, reveals really interesting discoveries about how maths is delivered in FE colleges. But then the next step isn't taken to involve practitioners in the implementation of those findings. That's through no fault, of course, of the researchers, but it is the fault of policy steps in regards to devising policies for the sector. So if you look at those, a tale of three documents, and it's always a bit messy, hence the crossing out. It's always a little bit messy in the sector. Speculations, I'd call them, rather than documents. But these documents are all ways currently of trying to figure out how the sector can develop. And each of them, in their own way, suggests a take on research and a take on research culture, but in very different ways. The tale of the three documents, as I say, is that typical messy approach that we get, which I've crossed out and called speculations, because they each of them have a take on research, but in very different ways. The College of the Future English report, which I would recommend everybody to read in terms of getting excited about substantial change that looks absolutely promising. I think we're fed up of change, but I think we're not fed up of change that looks promising and looks fruitful. And the College of the Future sets out what colleges could look like in 2030, and that report has got a place for research. There are more implications for research if one wanted to really see how that report could be implemented, but it is very fruitful beginning. And then added to that, the Commission for the College of the Future also produced another report which was even more interesting, which was about creating the workforce of the future. And in that report they outlined how the FE sector, remember the anchor institution, would support and develop the training for the NHS, for integrated care systems as they will be in the regions. So one anchor institution would be the supporter of skills and training for another anchor institution. The great irony, of course, is that both of those anchor institutions are sorely in need of funding, are sorely in need of continuous professional development strategies and policies, but nevertheless, the fruitfulness of that model is a real chance to begin a serious conversation. So I would say that those first two documents demand a real review of research culture and how research would help the FE sector support that other anchor institution of the NHS. And then we come to the third document, the third speculation, which unfortunately is the drizzling out period here, because the white paper has very little to say about how those sorts of models of change would happen, and it mostly reserves FE professionalism and research culture to the current status quo, which is primarily the delivery models provided by the Education and Training Foundation. Now let's turn to why we're in this position that we've got such strained approaches to professionalism and research culture. On the one hand, we've got the great promise of how it could be, and on the other, we've got a very restrictive approach, arguably, as to how research can be embedded in the FE sector. And I think that on this regard, we do need to remember a little bit of history here. This is heretical history because it's not been told, and a lot of people may not agree. But if you were there at the time, some very, very interesting things happened, and it's a tale for us in the present. Rather than think that what we currently have is here for all time, if we just look back into the recent past, we'll see that things were very different and could have led to a very different situation today. So the Institute for Learning, for instance, in its day, developed the professional profile of the FE sector. It was the arbiter, it was the regime of professionalism, particularly between 2007 to 2012, when we had a fully regulated notion of professionalism with an IFL council, with mandatory CPD, that is that colleges had to abide by that practice, and with a focus upon professionalism in the most expansive way you could imagine. The question is with IFL, for whatever its faults, at its high point, it had a membership of 200,000. It covered the whole skills sector. So it was and never really developed into its full profile, but it was a significant architect of professionalism. And I would certainly say that it's arguable that the reason why we still have those conversations is because of that intervention. I'm not sure we'd be in the same place now. The interesting thing with IFL was it couldn't get traction within colleges. So when surveys were done of how were colleges responding to the research that was currently being mandatorily undertaken by their staff, there was absolutely zero response. I mean, the data that was shared between ATL at the time at NEU and UCU showed that there was absolutely no traction whatsoever. It was a handful of cases where a college took seriously the CPD its staff were doing. And then the other question was, when it came to it, was the government wanted IFL to be in some way self-financing, and it passed then the obligation for that self-financing back to the social partners as they were at that time. That is IFL, Association of Colleges, the trade unions, and the government. And the government at that time argued this was their policy of a partnership at the time, believe it or not, but it was a third, a third, a third. So they would contribute a third if the trade unions could convince their members to take some fee paying, because it was at that time self-financing and voluntary, and non-fee paying, and whether the employers would. And at that point, although there was a boycott on fees, there was an agreement that those fees could be put to members at a much reduced rate, and it was a token rate. Unfortunately, the employers at that time didn't feel that they could contribute. They felt they contributed enough, with generic CPD and the CPD offered in colleges. So the point is that at one point in that decision-making process, there could have been agreement around a professional body that was shared in terms of financing by its members, by government, and by the employers, and that was turned down. The second step in this heretical tale was that when IFL disbanded, they didn't simply renege on their obligations to develop professionalism in the sector. They tried to secure the best way forward for that body, and they sought like-minded organisations to support that and take that forward. In other words, they were happy at that point to gift and bequest IFL to like-minded bodies. That was a major opportunity that again would have led to a very different present. Ultimately, they returned to the government agency fold and were gifted to the Education and Training Foundation. But I'd just like to point out that there are major decisions have been taken and are taken that are not that are taken seriously and are not simply about government running roughshod over policy. There are times when we can make decisions that can change things. The Education Training Foundation then took on a membership of around 8,000, and I believe they're around about 15,000 now in terms of membership. Most who've taken that membership obviously are following the QTLS route. Rather than simply being members of a professional body, it's mandatory to update and upkeep your membership profile as a professional, but it really hangs on the QTLS qualification. For a period, most of that qualification was taken by schools, school teachers, and by work-based learning. So there's a real question about articulation here of professional interests. And then finally, LSRN that has beavered away through this process and has its roots, though, back in the days of the LSDA, the Learning and Skills Development Agency, which used to hold major conferences around research. So we've had real dips and highs of interest in trying to secure and articulate a professional presence in the sector. And we need to remind ourselves, because when I think, certainly when I've had, I wouldn't dare call it research, but when I've had focused conversations around this area with lecturers and teachers and support staff, there is a real question around what it is and what is their status. So we need to remind ourselves always about what a professional body is, what it attains to, and why it's the case that we are still a semi-profession in terms of a voluntary professional body, voluntary professional regulation by the employer. That is, the employer determines whether the qualifications are sufficient to teach, which of course is an oddity because QTLS does have legal parity with QTS, hence the school teacher take-up. And then these are questions I'd like to start probing more about professional decision making. About what is it that we're making or could make professional decisions about? Professional recognition at the level of practice. Internal observations and Ofsted are internal observations or external observations, but at the level of the professional in themselves, isn't that the case that they should be able to do that themselves? That's what a professional arguably would do. And then finally, so a really controversial issue, but I think one that has to be faced, and I think Kevin may be talking along similar lines in terms of the inquiry, is that it surely has to be the case as well that if it is a profession, then that professional expertise, it must be different to others. It must be. It can't be the same as a wider professional claim. So it has to be related to one's occupational mastery and competence. And that, of course, could extend to different aspects of activity within further education, whether it's teaching, whether it's student support, whether it's ESOL, but we have to tease out the levels of expertise and then who is warranted to make particular decisions for learners and on behalf of learners. So the social worth of professional expertise is recognised. it is not magic. We have to actually work hard at trying to show the social worth of that expertise. I'm just moving now to the final couple of slides. So the perennial problem, arguably, I think, and why research culture is difficult is because it also lacks an environment of professionalism which enables it to breathe. Professional expertise enables one to then talk about when is it recognised and acknowledged. It enables one to say professional space, when is it formed and who forms it? And crucially, it means that professional voice is how is it articulated at local and national levels. And that leads to the whole concept of the need for a community of practice and what that would mean. And by community of practice is not meant a community, nor is it a community in practice. It's not about simply doing the research or being a professional. It's about the sharing of a community of practice. And what that might mean then is that when we look at the areas that we need to investigate and research to be able to articulate these areas of interest, then we've got a whole host of areas that can come through about vocational expertise itself. What is it? We've never been able to define a vocational expertise in the sense of what it is a lecturer needs and what it is an industry expert needs. For too often we're told that an industry expert is simply imported in because they're an expert in their area, but I've never seen it stated, and certainly IFL didn't do this at the time. They've never produced a tariff that has enabled us to identify what is vocational expertise before you then go on and teach in the sector. And that's the problem with the notion of dual professionalism. So those other areas of pedagogy, curriculum, learner support, teacher training, policy lobbying, all of those areas are ones for research. And I think this shows that when Gary Husband, he made a presentation at the conference last month and said quite rightly that a lot of the research was based upon, was quality driven, was in other words, performance driven. We have fallen into that cul-de-sac for a long time, but there are rich areas that could be developed that actually form a part of the professional voice within the workplace. And so finally, I'd just like to say, you know, from all of those issues and those histories, for FE research, what will it take? I think it demands something greater than simply research. It actually needs a new paradigm around research in FE. Similar to, in some ways, the HE scholarship project, because it needs to define what it is and what it is about and who does it. And I take that view that actually everything changes in a new paradigm, because it's no longer simply the lecturer doing research. There then is the element of the researcher, who's a new subject of activity within the sector. And then there is the then added issue, is then there are new objects in town, because it's no longer simply the data given by the college or by inspections or by government. The subject then of, the object then of research then is determined by the new research subject. So what we have then is new relationships being developed around practice, because that is actually a new form of knowledge within the sector that currently has no space to be articulated. In order for a paradigm like that, if you agree that could happen, then we need new supportive agents and collaborations to agree a new paradigm. As I said before, and I'm just going to be finishing up, Rachel, is that, as I said before, there have been issues around who supports research and professionalism when push comes to shove. And I think we can safely say, certainly I always use the watershed of 92, but I certainly would say that it's clear who has supported and who hasn't supported research and professionalism in the sector. And I think we really need to get real about that and start to talk to ourselves about who thinks there should be this intervention, because there's certainly the case that college architectures and line management structures have got difficulty in doing that, not necessarily because they're averse to it, they simply haven't got the time to develop it. And I think there needs to be a willingness to let go and let that community of practice flourish, rather than being too overly pedantic about the type of research it's doing and about what it's focusing on. So the determination to support the boundaries of that community of practice, I think, are crucial. And I do think there's a wide consensus needed around HEIs, universities, trade unions, professional bodies, charitable organisations, employers, you name it, anybody who's interested in developing expertise as it will enable vocational skills and training to develop is part of those conversations. So I hope that that has given some thought. I'm not saying that's the answer. It is a heretical tale after all, but I just hope it does provoke some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Norman. You know, a real provocation really to thinking, and to, you know, I think it's already generated a bit of you know, communication in the chat. We're going to move straight on to the next speaker now, to Joyce, but I think, you know, let's keep that conversation going, because I think there's so many things raised there which we can usefully pick up on as we go through the afternoon. So thank you so much, Norman. I'm going to pass over now to Joyce, who, well, I think you'll explain, Joyce, but you've chosen to record your presentation for pragmatic reasons, which you know, I think everyone will understand.
Yeah. I said to Rachel, I'm doing a little bit of experiment here because I have been to several events before, and sometimes I have technical issues, and plus I got children at home. So, you know, basically I use a recording, and I will start my presentation now. Thank you. Hi, my name is Joyce I-Hui Chen. Thank you for having me at the conference today. I work at the College of West Anglia, which is a further education college in Norfolk, and my work includes teacher education, mentoring and coaching, organizational development and quality improvement. I am also a doctorate student at the University of Sunderland. My presentation title today has been inspired by an article by Roseman and Rallis in 2010, Everyday Ethics, Reflections on Practice. They describe research as praxis and the researcher as practitioner. I have decided to flip this phrase to reflect my position as a further education lecturer, an advanced practitioner, a teacher educator, a researcher, and a lifelong learner. Hence my title of the presentation today. To start with, I'd like to explain the purpose of my presentation. It's in three parts. I'd like to share my experience as a practitioner researcher in a general further education college. The first part will be sharing my research journey as an example. Secondly, drawn from the methodology chapter of my current doctorate thesis, I would like to highlight the complexity of conducting close to practice research projects, or sometimes people may describe it as work-based research projects. Finally, I would like to provide some possible strategies and suggestions to deal with some of the issues which may arise when conducting work-based research projects. There are two questions I would like to ask you, and also to respond to this question to myself. Why research? Or sometimes you may say, why not research? Why participatory action research? At a personal and professional level, my motivation for starting research is professionalism. Particularly, I believe that teachers are role models of lifelong learning for our students. But you may choose different ways to continue your learning in relation to professionalism, and research is one of them for me. In 1975, Lawrence Stenhouse, who was the pioneering educational researcher and philosopher in Britain, he advocated research-based teaching and the concept of teacher as researcher. He argued that it is not enough that teachers' work should be studied. They need to study it themselves. At the same time, the opening sentence in Peter Park in 1997, he wrote an article about participatory research democracy, and community. He stated participatory research is people's research. He emphasized that at the core of research is also the activity of finding knowledge that people need for problem solving on an everyday basis. To be effective in these situations, we must have good information. We must know the whys and the hows as well as the whats of the problem. The purpose of participatory action research for me is to bring about change by engaging in beneficial social activities. You may be wondering why I have this image here. What are they? Yes, they are jigsaw puzzles. I like to use this image to describe what doing research is like. For me, doing research is like putting the puzzles together, which at first appears to be really messy with lots of clues, too many unsolved questions and answers. And I suppose it remains true throughout the process. But with a systematic sorting, ordering, and categorizing, with plenty of reading, writing, and practice, the full picture will slowly become clearer. It is even better if you solve the puzzles together by joining with others. Doing action research is like a grown-up way of showing our curiosity through making inquiries with a systematic process by being involved and involving others in this process collaboratively. For me, it's a joy to do research, although I wouldn't describe having the joy throughout the whole process, but I definitely believe that it is important to maintain your motivation throughout the process. In my next part of the presentation, I'd like to show you a brief timeline of my research journey as an example, and some of them relates to my own reflection. As you can see on this slide here, my very first action research project dated back to 1999 with my word-based teaching practice mentor. I was a newly qualified teacher. The experience and influence from my mentor to carry out research and look for possible solutions to practical problems in teaching learning assessment was truly powerful. In 2003, I completed a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, TESOL, in the UK, and benefited from building my foundation knowledge and skills as a student researcher. But much of the study was from an outsider researcher's perspective, with very little consideration of my own philosophy and methodology as a researcher. After settling into teaching in a further education college, I completed a further 3 practitioner-led action research projects between 2012 and 2016. They were funded by Learning and Skills Excellence Association, but also by the Education and Training Foundation. This background is important to me as a teacher, as well as a teacher educator, because my own beliefs and values in professional development and learning has gradually developed from a passive receiver to situating myself as a more proactive educator through systematic approaches to research, critical thinking and analysis, and reflection and reflexivity. This process also occurs through internal and external collaboration with colleagues, students, and other practitioner researchers and higher education supervisors in and outside of my workplace. Consequently, this personal reflection contributes to the reason why practitioner-led participatory action research has been chosen as my main research methodology and methods in my own doctorate thesis. Perceiving the process of writing my thesis is not only for my own learning, but for me to learn together with my colleagues and students. To give you a very brief introduction of my thesis, On this slide, you can see my thesis title and the purpose of my research. The title has probably been changed about 20 times. I think it's quite a common process, when you start doing your research project. You may keep thinking and changing anything, the course of the directions as well. As I said, I would like to focus on a very small part of my methodology chapter, particularly on work-based research projects. There are various ways to describe research that is conducted at your own workplace, and I think it's really beneficial to be aware of those different terms. You may come across close to practice research, insider research, practitioner-based inquiry, work-based research, and participatory action research. And as you can see, I have included some of the references here, if you are interested in reading more about those different types of research projects. On the next couple of slides, I would also like to just bring to your attention about the definitions of close to practice research. Joyce et al. In 2018 defines close to practice research, focuses on issues defined by practitioners as relevant to their practice and involves collaboration between people whose main expertise is research, practice, or both. They further define what high quality close to practice research should look like. It requires the robust use of research design, theory, and methods to address clearly defined research questions through an iterative process of research and application that includes reflections on practice, research, and context. I think it would be quite nice to take this further for discussion about what close to practice research actually is, and what does high quality research actually look like in practice. I think we don't have the scope today to discuss it in depth, but certainly I think it would be quite an interesting area for some of you who may consider or are doing practitioner-led action research or any kind of research projects at the moment to have discussion about this. So in my final part, I would like to just highlight some of the benefits and maybe limitations of conducting close to practice research. The most obvious benefit would be having the instant and direct access to your workplace and people. You may also consider that because you have pre-existing relationship and understanding of the hierarchy and the culture of your workplace, so it might save some time and efforts to access to the research site or sites and participants. However, for me, it's the opposite, which I will describe in my next slide. And many people believe that close to practice research is research of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's also helpful to be familiar with the language used by your participants and having the local knowledge and the context of the research site or sites. And you may come across the term ecosystem. And finally, it may have the benefit of receiving more in-depth data because you have more regular contact with your participants and maybe being part of the crowd. But as I said, it's a bit like two sides of the coin. Although these are the benefits, but there are equally issues which relate to close to practice research. On this slide, I would like to highlight some of the challenges. The most important consideration throughout any kind of research is ethical considerations. So, for example, power relations and your multiple roles in your workplace may cause some kind of issues. And sometimes, for me, it actually takes longer to access to the research sites and participants. This is due to there's too much pre-understanding and knowledge about you exist. So related to the first point, you need to consider the positionality of your place as a researcher. And over here, you may come across the insider and outsider continuum. And for me, everyone is an insider in some ways, but outsider in other ways. It is important to recognize and balance your positionality with various of your roles in the workplace. As I said, preconceptions may also cause issues and bias because too much knowledge has been known or may be thought to be known about the participants' opinions. But equally, many assumptions can already be made by the researcher and the participants, which can lead to a premature conclusion. So how do we manage the various of challenges when you are conducting work-based research projects? There are some strategies and suggestions I would like to offer, but they are also can be found in some of the literature you may come across. For me, it's important to seek advice from more experienced staff. So they could be your colleagues who have conducted research, or they are also conducting research themselves. It's really helpful to have a community of practice with people you know and trust to share your thoughts, your reflection, and also looking for solutions together. For me, the reason why I have chosen to study my doctorate study is also have the benefit of an external mentor and supervisor. I find it particularly helpful because sometimes the supervisor and mentor will guide you carefully and also give you some directions when you come across some of those challenges. Equally, I have a network of critical friends who may not be in the same subject as I'm studying, but we could challenge each other and also help each other in facing some of the problems I discussed early on. Again, ethical considerations are really important throughout any research project. It's not only just a chapter or a section of your discussion, your thesis. And over here, you can see, as I describe it strongly, ethical considerations are not just about signing a piece of consent form. It's really important to spend and invest time to consider, plan, and investigate how you will approach your research sites and participants, even before you consider writing up any of your research questions and so on. And it's important to engage and communicate with your participants throughout. And for me, it's even important during this difficult time at the moment. Although I have completed my data collection, I continue to show my care and support with my participants way after my data has been collected. And again, it's really important to think about how you can ensure confidentiality and deal with any kind of conflicts or critical incidents which may arise during your participation with your participants. Again, it's really important as a researcher, as a responsible researcher, keeping a reflexive journal. And for me, it's ongoing development of my own reflective practice on my own, but also collectively. My final suggestion, which is probably the most important one of all, is to make sure the ethics of care, not only just for yourself as a researcher and all the multiple roles you have to balance in the workplace. It's also important to ensure your participants and the wider communities are also being careful. To conclude my presentation, I just want to show you another direct quotation by Smith and Holley. And again, I'll give you a few seconds to read and pause. The insider researcher must work to stay in touch with their feelings to ensure that they are not caught in familiar patterns and experiences of organizational life, becoming too close to the processes and unable to rigorously interpret the data. Finally, I would like to say thank you, and please do ask any questions. And I'm very happy for you to contact me even after the event. Please do connect me on LinkedIn or the Twitter handle here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Don't know how you react to that because it was a recording. Although I'm here, I'm very busy reading people's chat. It's so amazing. Thank you so much. There's so much going on there. You know, I think I need to spend some time to read through it again. So I don't know if anybody's got any immediate question, or I'll hand back to Rachel as well.
I think, yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Joyce. And, you know, you've triggered a whole, you know, stream of interactions within the chat, and so many interesting points coming out there. Issues around, you know, is research just about curiosity? Is that another some sort of debate going on there, which was fascinating. So I suggest what we do now is we move into the breakout rooms, which will give you an opportunity to explore some of those issues, you know, in smaller groups. So nice to see everyone back again. I'm going to pass over now to Kevin Orr. I'll let you introduce yourself, Kevin. I'm sure you will as part of your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. My name is Kevin Orr, and I'm a professor at the University of Huddersfield, and for a long time taught in further education, and I always say this, further education is where my heart remains. Thank you to Rachel for inviting me to speak today, and let me say it is a particular pleasure to be speaking to the Learning and Skills Research Network, which is an organisation which I have had affection for and affinity with for a long time. And LSRN is one of the only organisations that has been able to maintain itself over a long period of time in further education when everything else appears to have been changing. And I think that in itself is worth celebrating. And it has maintained itself precisely because of the goodwill and the commitment of people like Rachel and many others in this audience, to whom I am grateful. Okay, so what I've been asked to talk about today is the place of subject specialist knowledge in the professional learning of teachers in further education. And what I want to make, broadly speaking, 3 points. That subject specialist knowledge is a troubling concept, but it is still worth engaging with, and it might even help to develop the further education teaching profession, and I will argue it may even protect the FE teaching profession to some extent. But let me start with this first, the first of those, that it is a troubling concept. And certainly for Ofsted, they have identified it as being a particularly troubling concept. This report was published in 2003, not long after Ofsted had started to inspect ITT and further education. And they, at that time, made this point, that while the tuition that trainee teachers receive on the taught elements of their courses is generally good, few opportunities are provided for trainees to learn how to teach their specialist subjects, and there is a lack of systematic mentoring and support in the workplace. This criticism from Ofsted is one that has continued, and I think it is also reflected in the Sainsbury report from a few years ago and in the Augur review. And I think that the recent T-levels, the introduction of T-levels with their focus on knowledge, is also reflective of this kind of criticism. Part of this is, though, an attempt always to compare further education with schools. But, as we know, and this is from my colleague Ron Thompson, his review of teacher education from a few years ago, FE teachers often have subject qualifications below degree level, and a significant proportion have only level 3 qualifications, although they may be expert vocational practitioners. Their expertise may be held tacitly rather than in terms of codified knowledge. Now, this kind of critique of subject knowledge is reflected in other discussions. one taken up by my colleagues Roy Fisher and Keith Webb in an article from 2006, discussed a general critique of the very concept of having discrete subject knowledge, when knowledge is becoming arguably more interdisciplinary, and where, to quote a well-known Tory grandee, who needs experts. I'm glad to say that that kind of dismissal of expert knowledge has gone the way of many things under COVID. But nonetheless, it exists as an epistemic current. But perhaps most importantly for further education is the comparison with schools, where even a reasonably large high school might only have a dozen or so different subjects. A large college may have up to 200 different specialist areas as identified by Jim Crawley. So subject knowledge is difficult within the further education sector. Nonetheless, I think it is worth hanging on to. I think it is worth protecting, because phrases like learning by doing and hands-on learning can be problematic. This comes from the Commission on Adult Vocational Teaching and Learning, their report from 2013, that phrases such as learning by doing and so on can perpetuate the unhelpful dualism of mind as separate from body, and suggest that vocational learning needn't bother itself with the acquisition of underpinning knowledge. This denigrates subject specialist knowledge in vocational areas, and I think helps to reinforce the divide between academic and vocational knowledge and vocational courses, which reflects inequalities within society. But much of this notion of learning by doing and so on, which is so prevalent in further education, and in many cases can seem quite innocuous, it does stem from an overemphasis, I would argue, on experiential learning. We learn lots from experience, but there is a limit. And here I think the writing of Michael Young and Lisa Wheelahan, amongst others, is very helpful. What Michael Young has written is this: that the mistake of all such theories associated with experiential learning, is to use the amazing capacity everyone has for experiential or informal learning as a model for the quite different task of moving beyond our experience, the opportunity that schools, and I've added here colleges, as I think Michael Young would do himself, and teachers uniquely provide. Michael Young, in a different work, says something which I still find electrifying a long time after I first read it. He talks about a knowledge-based theory of curriculum that recognizes the distinction between the type of knowledge that can be acquired at school, college, and university, and the common sense or practical knowledge that we acquire in our everyday lives. To put it more generally, because the world is not as we experience it, curriculum knowledge must be discontinuous, not continuous with everyday experience. We want our students to learn more than they experience. We want them to think about things that they have never experienced, but they may do in the future. We want a curriculum that goes beyond experience, and that includes, I think, subject knowledge. Now, over the past few years, I have spent quite a lot of time talking to architects. Alas, not these particular architects, Amanda Levitt, Rem Koolhaas and Norman Foster, although I do really like Rem Koolhaas's pull a neck jumper. But what I have learned from architects, talking to qualified architects about the way that they learn, is this: architecture is a well-established profession where it goes back into Victorian times, how architects are trained, but more importantly, there's a strong element of experiential learning combined with, in most cases, university teaching. And speaking to architects, what I learned was that sometimes there should be a tension between what is experienced on placement and what is learned in the college. College should not just ape what happens in the workplace. Again, that requires subject specialist knowledge. that tension can lead to purposeful learning and to independent decision making for the students themselves, both in relation to becoming architects or indeed any other subject, but also in relation to their lives. And I think this is also very important, especially when we look at the white paper that was published just a few weeks ago. Vocational knowledge is not just what current employers say they require from their employees. It has to be much more than that. And what was important for me talking to these architects was they said this is what keeps their profession fresh, that there is a tension between what is learnt in universities or in college and what happens in the workplace. That tension, I think, is important, and that tension requires teachers in colleges to have good subject specialist knowledge. And yet, unfortunately, the learning associated with many lower level vocational qualifications remains task-focused, fragmented, and lacking any serious underpinning theory or deep knowledge. Students who receive that kind of course, they are not going to think, not going to be able to think associated with the course beyond their experience. They will be limited, not just in terms of their career, but also, I would argue, in terms of their access to what society can offer. And here, I think we have to say that subject knowledge, like other forms of knowledge, is to do with social justice. This is from Anne-Marie Bathmaker, and I still find this very powerful. The issue of knowledge is not just a technical question, but it relates to questions of equity and justice. If vocational educational qualifications are to enable people to gain valuable knowledge and skills and are to open up opportunities rather than constrain and limit futures, then questions of knowledge in these qualifications and how these questions are decided are crucial. If we dismiss the idea of subject knowledge, we simply dismiss 50% of young people to that they are not worth knowledge. And I utterly and completely refute that. So, trying to tie this together then, what does this mean then for the professional learning of further education teachers? Well, subject knowledge is an important pedagogical resource. What I mean by that is it's not just content to teach students. If you know your subject well, you're aware of threshold concepts, you're aware of the kind of assumptions that students might make that need to be unlearned, you know how to sequence learning so that it can be learned in a way that is logical and allows students to progress. So subject knowledge is an important pedagogical resource and one that we should not overlook. I think especially amongst, I find this amongst craft teachers who might have antipathy towards the very idea of pedagogy, that starting with subject knowledge is a good place to start talking about pedagogy. How did you learn what you do? What do you think your students should learn first? How do you know whether a student is able to do the things that you want them to do? So it's a good place to start talking about knowledge. But for me, perhaps most importantly, is that knowledge, and especially abstract knowledge, not just applied knowledge, especially abstract knowledge, allows students to think the not yet thought, which is a phrase used by Lisa Wheelahan and by Basil Bernstein. So it is a social justice issue as well as a pedagogical issue, if indeed you can separate those things. But I've also said that it can protect the professionalism of FE teachers. Because if subject specialist knowledge is not required, then you don't need subject specialist teachers. You can have what is referred to as the teacher-proof curriculum. And that is the phrase that's used, the teacher-proof curriculum. And if you don't need teachers, then you can have generalist trainers who can only follow instructions and who are paid much less. Frankly, we have seen a lot of this in further education over the last 30 years. So in protecting the professionalism, the status of further education teachers, subject knowledge is still important. So, bringing this to an end, I have said that subject knowledge is a troubling concept. It's not straightforward, and I have skimmed over it over the last 13 and a half minutes. It is a troubling concept. I do think it's worth engaging with because I think it matters for teaching and I think it matters for social justice, especially in relation to vocational areas, and it might even help develop and indeed protect the further education teaching profession, if we are to protect and to value subject specialist knowledge. But there are some questions that I will leave you with in my last minute, if I may do so, which are these. How do we conceptualize or define subject specialist knowledge for FE teachers, given the complexity of the FE sector? And how can we ensure that FE teachers continue to develop their subject specialist knowledge when they are so pooled in many other ways? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And actually, you were inadvertently picking up on themes that came out in Norman's presentation at the start of the afternoon, about industry experts and their role, that they might play. So thank you very much. Facilitators will probably have been rapidly scribbling down those questions as well, because they're ones that we can take into the breakout rooms this afternoon. So thank you. I'm going to pass over now, straight on to Lou Mycroft, who I can see down the bottom corner of my screen. Hi, Lou. So I'm really grateful to Lou for being here. I know you've come straight from another training session this afternoon, so thank you for being here. And I'll let you take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And yeah, I'm gutted I've not been able to be here for the whole thing. So this is particularly nerve-wracking because I thought I was, I'm coming along to LSRN, I'm going to do a presentation. And then last week I passed my Viva and, a few minors, but essentially I've passed. And suddenly I was getting lots of messages saying, we're so excited, you're going to tell us about your research. So I felt like I've had all the world on my shoulders ever since. So this is a whistle-stop tour, looking a little bit at not just the concept of anti-fragile, but actually how it is to work in anti-fragile ways. And I'm going to be talking about Joy FE and the practices of care and endurance. And it's really connected with my research, which has taken 6 years and was an activist project from the start. So the activism and the research is all mixed up together. So I need to set the scene. I took a complex set of philosophies and a simple methodology, and I brought them together to try and imagine something new. The context for my work was community education. So the philosophies were critical post-humanism. And that is it's a convergence of post-Vitruvian and post-anthropocentric thinking. So I'm going to break that down. But that was the complex bit. And I used a single question mass observation survey as my research tool. So that was very, very simple. Just to break down that post-human. Post-Vitruvian, you can see Vitruvian Man there, Leonardo's in all his glory. That's about moving beyond the concept of the uber-human that we carry in our heads, in our structures, in our processes. White, male, able-bodied, he's pretty hench, isn't he really, and presumed educated, affluent, straight. The philosopher Simone Bignall says that in our times, the further we are away from that Vitruvian ideal as individual human beings, the closer we are to death. So this is pretty high stakes stuff. And in critical post-humanism, this converges with post-anthropocentrism, getting over the idea that humans are it. So human exceptionalism has damaged our earth beyond repair. And this is a movement which recognizes with growing evidence that all matter is one, and it writes animals, rivers, other aspects of nature back into consideration. And, we just have to consider the potential origins of COVID to have a convincing rationale for that. And I want to be really, really clear that cyborgs are not involved in this form of post-humanism at all. So last night I was talking with some wonderful people about the word serendipity, and someone defined it as desirable experiences found by accident. And this coming together of critical post-humanism and community education was one of those things. It was literally a footnote in a really early draft of my research proposal that sent me down this rabbit hole. So to be post-Vitruvian means we're all in this together. but we're not one and the same. And to be post-anthropocentric writes the rest of nature back into the story. And then community education, which had a slippery definition all the way through that 6 years, I ended up with a working definition that community education is intentional adult and intergenerational learning which takes place communally, so with others physically or virtually. And it's transversal, so it's not just the stuff that we see in FE as funded by the adult education budget. It's youth work, it's community work, it's all the stuff that happens in the third sector. And I wanted to be able to just set the scene with that. I plugged this complex philosophical lens into a single question, and I had 400 responses after I'd scattered the question to the four winds on social media. What if you forgot everything you knew about community education and reimagined it for now? What would it look like? And I tell you, friends, it looks absolutely nothing like what we have now, and it looks like nothing we've ever had. I studied with Rosie Braidotti at Utrecht University over 4 summers, and the genealogy of her post-human approach has its roots with this guy here, this Baruch Spinoza, 17th century Dutch philosopher, as a finger puppet. And he made himself unpopular with everybody by claiming that God wasn't a bearded bloke in a cloud, but actually this life force that animates us all. Man, woman, child, animal, river, tree. He was the original philosopher of joy. And joy, in his definition, being the relations between us in those moments of connection and shared energy, which of course he thought of as God. You know, God is immanent, as in all of us. But this is where thinking happens. This is where ideas are born. So imagine not just a conversation between humans, but a light bulb moment walking down a frosty lane or taking the dog out for a walk. It's about, you know, that sort of, that enlivening, animating process of connection. My research took 6 years, cost 12 grand, encompassed 80,000 words, and there were 45,000 words in participant contributions, and its output was 10 practice values, these here, and 5 lines of flight. And that feels like a really expensive hobby, I have to say, but it was an activist project from the start. And I'm going to follow just a couple of those lines of flight in this presentation today. But before I do that, and I think I've missed a slide somewhere, just bear with me. Ooh. I think I've lost a slide, so I'm going to have to just speak from my notes. So before that, I want to introduce you to another couple of Spinozan concepts. Some of you will have heard me talk about this. The idea that power is not one thing, but 2 different things. So he was writing in Latin. He had 2 words for power, and they were potestas, which is power and politics as usual, hierarchies, structures, power as we understand it, and potentia, which is activist power. And he split these, and he wrote very separately about these things. Rosie Braidotti, who I studied with in Utrecht, claims that a good career is 2/3 potestas and 1/3 potentia. And my research imagines what these 5 streams of activism might look like if that ratio was turned on its head. 1/3 potestas, just enough to have some clout, and 2/3 of that activist potentia energy. And my proposition is that this is what we need in uncertain times. That those hierarchies that were so strong and so sort of sturdy and were suited to heroic leadership, those are not the times that we're in now. A guy called Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls it anti-fragility, which is the ability to thrive not despite, but because of the uncertainty that we're facing and we've got ahead of us for some time to come. Sam Conniff, who's the author of Be More Pirate, he talks about uncertainty experts. Nancy Klein, whose Thinking Environment is such a cornerstone of my work, as many people know, she writes that to be anti-fragile means to have the resources to think through crisis together and arrive better than before. Imagine that. And she and other thinkers such as Jasmine Ulmer and Lee Patel advocate slow ontologies which sidestep the velocity of capitalism. In academia, they draw us into one more lecture, one more paper, one more funding bid, one more tweet even. So we have everything we need already. We just need to start seeing the world differently as it already exists. These are the preferably unheard voices, as Arundhati Roy would say, the preferably unseen alternate structures. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney talk about the undercommons. That's all of us who are here already refusing the academy of misery, which is how they talk about education. They say that people who are in further education have already diagnosed themselves as the problem, and I think that would resonate with a lot of people here, including me. The best bit of my Viva was when my examiner, Sarah Amsler, talked about how important it is to resist and refuse from within the academy, as well as doing activist work on the outside. And this is Moten and Harney's subversive intellectual. She came under false pretenses with bad documents out of love and I would say out of joy. Her labour is as necessary as it is unwelcome. The university needs what she bears but cannot bear what she brings. And on top of all of that, she disappears. So how can we stop the subversive intellectuals disappearing from view? How can we support them with a practice of care? So let's return to the lines of flight. You'll see solidarity made it in there. I was brave right at the end because it means something special and particular that other things do not, and it can be practiced. And I'm going to focus just a little bit on this line of flight 3, which is alliances, transversal, across any silo you might imagine, and number 5, which is professional learning. And here we come to Joy Effie. So at the very start of lockdown, on my birthday, my friend Steph Wilkinson, who many of you will know, called me and said, we have to do something. She knew I'd been working with joyful principles through a TED talk I'd done and following the work of Carla Bergman in Canada. And we started first day of lockdown with a 7 a.m. broadcast on Twitter. We did that every day for months. Within days, we got a WhatsApp group of fellow travellers, which was sort of like the mutual aid groups getting set up at the time. And then 2 weeks later at Easter, we wanted to learn how to think together in an efficient way. And we invented the Ideas Room, which is a new bootleg application of the thinking environment. They run every Wednesday at 8 o'clock publicly on Zoom. It's an hour that lifts your spirits. It's really magic. Those Ideas Rooms gave rise to a digital magazine, which we pulled together in a week. And we're now on our 11th edition with 2 bumper specials and a 3rd to come around adult conversations. We've hosted regular wellbeing events and I broadcast every morning still at 7:35, this time on Facebook. That hashtag community is still going strong. Friday playlist, all sorts of things happening. It's also part of a broader ecology of grassroots activism in FE. So we've got people here today who will recognise UK FE Chat, the FE Research Meet, hashtag community, PD North hashtag community, sometimes the same people encountering one another, sometimes not. Time-limited projects, constellations with permeable boundaries, based on, Braidotti's work, via Spinoza, via Gilles Deleuze, and myself and Kay Sidebottom have written about this, as some of you will know. Since Christmas, moving on to professional learning, there's been a new development. We've started just training each other. Impromptu opportunities to learn storyboarding, think through maths anxiety, trial new approaches to feedback, and much more. Nobody cares who's the teacher and who's the student, and nobody cared in my research either. Those 400 participants, they wanted co-production. So the impact and efficiency of this way of working is truly immense. The lessons have infused the AP Connect programme, which I run with Joss Kang for the Education and Training Foundation. We've shifted to building community through asynchronous communication spaces and then regular thinking spaces, rather than forcing people to be in a certain place at a certain time. And I think Christina Donovan is here today. We build trust, Christina, and we know that builds community. Educators are under inconceivable pressure. The job is transformed, which is not always ideal, but those educators who are future focused and my research participants do not want to go back to the inequalities of before. The Joy FE cry is no go backery. Yeah, and Jennifer Thetford-Cade from Shipley College, she coined that phrase. Over the last 11 months, we've modelled a practice of endurance which is critically joyful and never cynical, to paraphrase my friend Kevin Orr, who we've just heard from. We are still those dancing princesses, clearing the chairs back to the edge of the dance floor. We think together, we exchange ideas and energies. Our practice is expansive and anti-competitive. It's a practice of care. And we're changing cultures within organisations as we draw people into this new anti-fragile skill set, this social purpose, this new way of thinking and doing relationships. I want to say just a final thing, which is about serendipity. Last night in the Joy FE Ideas Room, I was in a group where we talked about this. Rhizomatic working in the way I've described here is no less intentional than any conventional way of operating professional learning. But something it does do is leave space for those serendipitous encounters, changes of pace and route, and new directions. So it's time for us to make the most of physical times together and also recognise what we can do better online. And if you're filing that away in a draw mark blended learning in your head, then here's a gentle post-human warning that need not look the way you think it does. I'm just going to finally share with you my cartography. Here for the first time, a praxis cartography, not a reference list with only the people who are allowed into the canon on the list, but from Spinoza to Marcida Hereshka, from Gilles Deleuze to Holly Barnes, practice evidence as well as theoretical evidence informing it every step of the way. And I hope that's just about coming on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lou. There was discussion, in the breakout rooms before about shifting cultures, within FE and the importance of that for developing, further research and so on. And I think you've just kind of broken all the boundaries to those spaces in a really, really helpful way. So thank you. Okay, so I think, let's take some of that joy, some of those stimuli that we've had from those two presentations into the breakout rooms again, and give you some space to think through some of the issues raised. Thank you. So unless there's something that I've missed in the chat that really needs addressing right this minute, I think we're coming to the point where we'll draw the afternoon to a close. Before we go, just a couple of things that I'd like to say. First of all, I'd like to thank the presenters for their time this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. And also the 10 facilitators who, willingly took up that role. And I'm really, really grateful to you for helping to make it a space in which we have been able to discuss and share ideas and not just, listen passively. So thank you very much. So let's continue the conversations that we've started today, contribute to the spreadsheet with your, some of your research interests. And even if you're not carrying out research at the moment, it may be a good place to have a look and see what other people are doing and see if there's somebody that you might want to connect with after the event. So thank you to everyone. And I don't need to wish you a safe journey. That's the other advantage of the current time. But have a lovely evening.